The morning fog settles into the vineyard terraces like water finding its level. It is early May in 1747, and the air above Potsdam carries the smell of turned earth, limestone dust, and something burning in the distance, perhaps coal, perhaps wood from the construction yards below. The light arrives slowly here, filtered through particle and moisture, touching first the uppermost dome of a palace that rises from geometrically ordered gardens, like a single perfect thought made solid. There is no wind. The silence suggests completion, but beneath it runs a different rhythm, the scrape of trowels, the grunt of men lifting stone, the creak of scaffolding that will not come down for another 2 years. This is Sanssouci, which means without care, without worry. The name itself is a promise, a fantasy, a lie that took 14 years and uncounted hands to build. From certain angles, the palace appears almost modest. 100 meters across, a single story perched atop 6 terraced levels of vineyards, its facade painted in colors that shift with the hour, ochre at dawn, butter yellow at noon, something close to gold when the sun descends behind the trees of the deer park. But modesty was never the intention. The building was designed to create the illusion of effortlessness, to suggest that grace and pleasure are natural states rather than manufactured ones, that a king might simply wake one morning and decide to build paradise on a sandy Prussian hillside, and the paradise might cost nothing at all. Every element of Sanssouci's design worked to conceal its own construction. The sweating laborers, the bills, the timber floated down the Havel River, the Italian sculptors sleeping 4 to a room in town, the arguments over payments, the broken backs and the exhausted horses. All of this was meant to vanish into the golden light of a summer afternoon. The man who conceived this place stood just over 5 feet tall and spoke French better than German, played the flute with genuine skill, and believed absolutely in the supremacy of reason even as he indulged in sentimentality and spectacle. Frederick II of Prussia, who would later be called the Great, was 33 years old when construction began in April of 1745. He had been king for 5 years. He had already fought one successful war against Austria, seizing the wealthy province of Silesia and establishing Prussia as a serious European power. He was educated, skeptical, prone to melancholy, and obsessed with the idea of creating a space where he could escape the suffocating rituals of court life in Berlin. His father, Frederick William I, had been a brutal disciplinarian who beat his children, forced Frederick into military service against his nature, and executed Frederick's closest friend in front of him when Frederick tried to flee Prussia at age 18. The psychological scars were permanent. Sanssouci was, among other things, an attempt to build a world his father could not enter. The site Frederick chose was unpromising. A barren hill on the edge of Potsdam, exposed to wind, lacking natural water sources, with sandy soil ill-suited to the kind of formal gardens fashionable in France and Austria. But Frederick saw not what was there, but what could be made to appear. He sketched the initial design himself, a single-story palace atop 6 vineyard terraces, the whole ensemble rising like a theater set from the flat northern European plain. The architect he hired, Georg Wenceslaus von Knobelsdorff, tried to argue for a basement level for practical reasons of storage and servants' quarters and mechanical systems. Frederick refused. He wanted to step directly from his bedroom onto the garden, to abolish any threshold between interior dream and exterior paradise. The building would have no basement, no attic, no unnecessary height. It would be a horizontal line against the sky, a stroke of human will across the landscape. This insistence on appearance over function created immediate problems. Without a basement, all the infrastructure required to run a royal residence, kitchens, pantries, wine cellars, storage for fuel and food, quarters for the small army of servants needed to maintain the king's comfort, had to be hidden elsewhere. Knobelsdorff designed a series of side buildings concealed behind hedges and earthworks, low structures that could house staff and machinery without interrupting the sightlines Frederick demanded. The main kitchen was placed in a separate building connected to the palace by an underground passage, which meant that food traveled nearly 50 meters from stove to table, arriving lukewarm at best. The heating system, which burned wood and later coal, required constant feeding by servants who had to enter and exit through carefully concealed doors, becoming invisible the moment they stepped into the king's field of vision. The construction began with earth. Thousands of cubic meters of soil had to be moved to create the terraced vineyard system, each level retained by stone walls brought from quarries 20 kilometers away. The stone itself, sandstone from Saxony, marble from Silesia, arrived by river barge and then by cart, the roads torn to mud by heavy wheels during spring thaw. Work crews numbered in the hundreds during peak construction years. Most were Prussian laborers conscripted through a system that blurred the line between employment and obligation, paid wages that were barely enough to feed a family, housed in temporary barracks that froze in winter and sweltered in summer. The skilled workers, stonemasons, plasterers, gilders, glaziers, came from across Europe, drawn by the promise of royal patronage and the reality of steady wages in a continent perpetually short of both. Frederick visited the site almost daily when he was in residence nearby, sometimes multiple times a day, critiquing angles and proportions, demanding changes that required undoing weeks of work. Knobelsdorff, a talented architect with his own vision, found himself increasingly frustrated by a patron who treated architecture as an extension of personal fantasy rather than a discipline with structural and financial constraints. The relationship deteriorated. By 1746, they were barely speaking. Frederick began working with other designers, diluting Knobelsdorff's vision, adding elements of Rococo whimsy that clashed with the architect's more restrained classicism. The palace that emerged was beautiful, but it was also a compromise born of conflict, a physical record of struggle between artistic egos. The central dome, gilded and crowned with a circle of sandstone figures representing the arts and sciences, required scaffolding that took 6 months to erect and cost more than the annual salary of 200 soldiers. The interior rooms, there were only 12 principal chambers, were finished with a level of decoration that bordered on obsessive. The ceiling of the marble hall featured paintings of vines and flowers in such detail that individual petals seemed to tremble with captured light. The walls were covered in pale green silk from Lyon, which faded within a decade and had to be replaced at ruinous expense. The floors were inlaid with patterns of contrasting woods, oak, walnut, cherry, mahogany, that required constant polishing to maintain their luster, a task performed on hands and knees by servants whose names do not appear in any surviving record. The vineyard terraces, Frederick's great innovation, were both aesthetic triumph and agricultural experiment. He imported grapevines from Burgundy, Champagne, and Italy, planting them in soil amended with sand and lime, tended by gardeners who understood that their employment depended on producing both beauty and wine. The terraces were faced with glass walls to trap heat, creating a microclimate warm enough to ripen grapes in a region where winter temperatures regularly dropped below freezing. The glass alone cost a fortune, each pane imported from Bohemia, transported with agonizing care, and installed by specialists whose skill was measured in the absence of cracks. When the vines finally matured and produced fruit, the wine they yielded was mediocre at best, thin and acidic, nothing like the French vintages Frederick preferred. But the terraces looked magnificent from below, a cascade of green geometry that announced human dominion over nature, and that was always the true point. Water was Sanssouci's constant challenge. The hilltop location meant that every drop had to be pumped upward from wells and cisterns, a feat of engineering that consumed wood for fuel and labor for operation. Frederick dreamed of great fountains, jets of water that would rival Versailles, turning the gardens into a celebration of hydraulic mastery. Engineers were hired, calculations were made, trenches were dug for pipes, and reservoirs were constructed. The fountains, when first tested in 1748, barely managed a sad trickle. The pumps lacked sufficient power, the water pressure was inadequate, and the vertical lift was simply too great for 18th century technology to overcome affordably. Frederick was furious. He ordered modifications, demanded better pumps, diverted funds from other projects. The fountains remained feeble. It would take nearly a century and the invention of steam-powered pumping before Sanssouci's waterworks functioned as originally imagined. By 1747, when Frederick finally moved into the palace, the project had consumed approximately 450,000 thalers, a sum that represented roughly 5% of Prussia's annual state revenue. This figure did not include ongoing costs, the staff required to maintain the building and gardens, the firewood burned during winter months, the replacement of furnishings and fabrics damaged by sunlight and humidity, the endless small repairs that any building demands. Frederick financed Sanssouci through a combination of state funds, war booty from the Silesian campaigns, and the profits from royal monopolies on salt, tobacco, and coffee. In effect, every Prussian household contributed to the king's dream of a carefree retreat, whether they knew it or not. The staff structure at Sanssouci reflected the rigid hierarchies of 18th century court life, but compressed into a smaller, more intimate space. At the top were the king's personal servants, valets, footmen, a reader, musicians who performed during evening concerts. Below them came the household managers who coordinated the practical operations, a major domo, a controller of provisions, a head cook with a small brigade of kitchen staff. Then came the laborers, maids who swept and dusted and carried water, gardeners who pruned and planted and raked gravel paths into perfect patterns, stablemen who tended the horses, laundresses who scrubbed linens in water heated over wood fires. At any given time, between 50 and 80 people worked to maintain the comfort and illusions of one man and his occasional guests. Frederick himself was a complicated employer. He paid well by contemporary standards, but he demanded absolute discretion and near invisibility from his servants. He wanted the palace to feel unpopulated, except by himself and his chosen companions, which meant that staff had to move through the building like ghosts, anticipating needs before they were spoken, cleaning rooms the moment they were vacated, materializing with food and drink and vanishing before thanks could be offered. This was emotionally exhausting work, requiring constant vigilance and the suppression of normal human presence. Servants who failed to meet Frederick's standards were dismissed without ceremony. Those who succeeded often spent decades in service, growing old in the shadow of a man who valued their labor but rarely acknowledged their existence. The king's daily routine at Sanssouci followed a pattern that varied little over decades. He rose at 4 a.m, summer and winter, and worked through correspondence and state papers until 7. Breakfast was coffee and fruit, served by a single valet. The morning hours were devoted to administrative work, military planning, and reading, usually philosophy or French literature. At noon, weather permitting, he walked in the gardens, inspecting the plantings, checking on construction projects, occasionally stopping to speak with gardeners about horticultural details. Lunch was at 1, a substantial meal that might include game, fish, vegetables from the estate gardens, and wine, though Frederick drank sparingly. Afternoons were for music, either practicing the flute or composing, and for conversation with invited guests, intellectuals, artists, foreign visitors deemed interesting or useful. These afternoon gatherings were the social heart of Sanssouci, the purpose for which the palace was ultimately designed. Frederick wanted a salon in the French style, a place where ideas could be debated freely, where wit and intelligence mattered more than rank or birth. He invited Voltaire to visit, though the philosopher's extended stay from 1750 to 1753 ended in bitter mutual recrimination. He corresponded with leading figures of the Enlightenment, positioning himself as a philosopher king who valued reason and culture above military glory, even though his wars had made Prussia powerful and would make it larger still. The conversations held in Sanssouci's elegant rooms touched on metaphysics, aesthetics, politics, and science, ranging across topics with the freedom that comes from having no immediate consequences, no hungry constituents, no real accountability to anyone except history. But history pressed in regardless. The 7 Years' War, which began in 1756, tested everything Frederick had built. Prussia found itself surrounded by enemies: Austria, France, Russia, Sweden, all determined to crush the upstart kingdom and reclaim lost territories. For 7 years, Frederick lived mostly in military camps, directing campaigns that cost tens of thousands of lives and brought his kingdom to the edge of destruction. Sanssouci stood empty except for minimal maintenance staff. The gardens grew wild. The glass on the vineyard terraces cracked from neglect and temperature extremes. The fountains, which had never worked properly, ceased operating entirely. The silk wall coverings faded and tore. The palace, built to symbolize a world without care, demonstrated instead how fragile such illusions truly are. Prussia survived the war through a combination of Frederick's military skill, extraordinary good luck when Russia's hostile empress died and her successor made peace, and the exhaustion of all parties involved. The cost was staggering. By 1763, Prussia's population had declined by nearly 500,000 people. Villages had been burned, fields left untilled, the economy reduced to subsistence. The state treasury was empty. Frederick, now 51 years old, returned to Sanssouci a changed man, physically broken by years of campaign life, emotionally devastated by losses that included close friends and thousands of soldiers who died on his orders. He would spend the remaining 23 years of his life rebuilding his kingdom and expanding his palace grounds, driven by a need to create order and beauty in a world he had seen reduced to chaos and ash. The post-war additions to Sanssouci transformed it from a summer retreat into a sprawling complex. Frederick commissioned new buildings: the new palace, a massive Baroque structure 3 times the size of Sanssouci itself, intended to demonstrate that Prussia remained powerful despite the war's devastation. The picture gallery, which housed Frederick's collection of paintings and was among the first independent museum buildings in Europe. The Chinese tea house, an exercise in Orientalist fantasy with gilded palm trees and life-sized sculptures of Chinese figures, and various temples, gazebos, and follies scattered through expanding parklands. Each structure required more staff, more maintenance, more fuel in winter, more water in summer, more of everything. The expanded Sanssouci employed at peak over 200 people in various capacities. The new palace alone needed a permanent staff of 70 just to keep it clean and heated, despite being used only for special occasions. The picture gallery required a curator and conservator to care for paintings that suffered damage from temperature fluctuations and humidity. The gardens, which now stretched across nearly 700 acres, needed an army of workers to maintain the geometric precision Frederick demanded. Gravel paths raked daily, hedges trimmed to mathematical exactness, flowers replaced at the first sign of fading, fallen leaves swept away before visitors noticed. The cost of this upkeep consumed an increasing percentage of royal revenue, justified by Frederick as necessary to Prussia's prestige, but functioning also as a massive jobs program that kept hundreds of families fed. Winter was always the hardest season. The palace's single-story design, which looked so elegant in architectural drawings, proved thermally inefficient. Heat rose immediately to the high ceilings and escaped through windows that fit poorly in their frames. Servants fed the porcelain stoves constantly, burning through cords of wood that had to be cut, split, transported, and stored in advance. Frederick himself often retreated to smaller, more easily heated rooms during the coldest months, abandoning the grand spaces to freezing silence. Ice formed on the inside of windows. The water in decorative basins froze solid. The staff who had to work in these conditions, carrying fuel and water and food through unheated passages, suffered chilblains, respiratory infections, and the grinding misery of cold that never quite goes away. Frederick died in August of 1786, in the same armchair where he had spent most of his final years, surrounded by his dogs, increasingly isolated from human contact. He left no children, having entered into a marriage of political convenience that was never consummated, and from which both parties retreated into separate lives as quickly as decorum allowed. His heir was his nephew, Frederick William II, a man of very different temperament, sensual where Frederick had been ascetic, conventional where Frederick had been iconoclastic, uninterested in philosophy and skeptical of the Enlightenment, values his uncle had championed. The new king found Sanssouci depressing, too small, too associated with a man whose shadow seemed impossible to escape. He visited occasionally, but never lived there, preferring the larger palaces in Berlin and the pleasures of a court that Frederick had despised. Sanssouci entered a long period of benign neglect. Staff numbers were reduced, maintenance budgets were cut, the gardens were simplified to reduce labor costs, the exotic plants that required special care were allowed to die or were replaced with hardier, cheaper varieties. The vineyard terraces, which had never produced good wine and had always been more ornamental than practical, were gradually abandoned, the glass panels removed and sold, the vines reverting to wild growth. Tourists began to visit, drawn by Frederick's growing legend as a military genius and enlightened ruler. Though this early tourism was informal, unmanaged, and generated no revenue for the estate. Visitors wandered the gardens, peered through windows, occasionally stole small items as souvenirs. There was no admission fee, no guided tours, no systematic effort to preserve what was increasingly being recognized as historically significant. The Napoleonic Wars brought a different kind of crisis. French troops occupied Potsdam in 1806, and Napoleon himself visited Sanssouci, standing at Frederick's grave and allegedly saying, "If you were still alive, I would not be here." Whether the quotation is accurate matters less than the symbolic weight it carried, one empire acknowledging the achievements of another while simultaneously demonstrating its defeat. The occupation was relatively brief, but it stripped the palace of valuables. Paintings were taken to Paris, furniture was requisitioned, carpets and tapestries disappeared. When Prussian authority was restored in 1814, Sanssouci looked shabby and looted, a reminder of humiliation rather than glory. The 19th century gradually transformed Sanssouci's meaning. Frederick the Great became a nationalist icon, his military victories reinterpreted as foundational moments in German unification, his palace a shrine to Prussian greatness. King Frederick William IV, who reigned from 1840 to 1861, developed a romantic fascination with his great-uncle and undertook the first systematic restoration of Sanssouci. He hired architects to repair structural damage, replace missing furnishings, and return the gardens to something approximating their 18th century appearance. He also began opening the palace to the public on a more formal basis, establishing fixed visiting hours and hiring custodians to guide tours and prevent theft. This restoration work revealed the extent to which the original palace had been structurally compromised. The decision to build without a basement meant that moisture from the ground had been wicking up through the walls for a century, rotting wooden supports, crumbling plaster, and staining painted surfaces. The foundations were inadequate for the weight they carried, causing cracks in walls and distortions in door frames. The roof, which had seemed such a simple element, leaked in multiple places, and each leak caused cascading damage to ceilings, furniture, and floors below. Fixing these problems required invasive work, excavating around the building's perimeter to install proper drainage, reinforcing walls with hidden steel braces, replacing entire sections of roof structure. The costs were enormous, and the work was never quite finished, because the fundamental design flaws could not be eliminated without rebuilding the palace from scratch, which no one was willing to do. The unification of Germany in 1871, with Prussia at its center and Berlin as the capital, gave Sanssouci new political significance. It became a destination for visiting dignitaries, a backdrop for state photographs, a symbol of German cultural achievement that could be displayed to foreign audiences. Kaiser Wilhelm I, and later Wilhelm II, used Sanssouci for occasional receptions and ceremonies, though neither lived there. The palace was too small and too old-fashioned for their tastes, lacking the modern conveniences that were becoming standard in royal residences: electric lighting, central heating, indoor plumbing with hot running water. Sanssouci remained lit by candles and oil lamps until 1900, and even then, the installation of electricity was limited to a few main rooms, with wires and fixtures carefully hidden to avoid disturbing the historical appearance. The First World War brought deprivation, but not destruction. Potsdam was far from the front lines, and Sanssouci was spared the physical damage that obliterated so much of European cultural heritage. However, the war's economic impact was severe. Germany's defeat, the abdication of the Kaiser, and the establishment of the Weimar Republic in 1918 meant that Sanssouci was no longer a royal palace but state property, its future uncertain. The Hohenzollern family retained some rights and properties, but Sanssouci was transferred to public ownership, managed by a new bureaucracy that had no experience with historic preservation and limited resources to dedicate to it. The 1920s and 30s were a time of improvisation. Sanssouci became a museum, but museums required funding, expertise, and a clear mission, all of which were in short supply. Admission fees were kept low to encourage working-class visitors, which meant revenue barely covered basic operating costs. The staff, now civil servants rather than royal retainers, were underpaid and often demoralized. Some rooms were closed to the public to save on heating and security. The gardens, which required constant labor to maintain, became simpler and wilder, the geometric precision giving way to a more naturalistic style that was easier to manage with fewer workers. The Nazi regime, which came to power in 1933, appropriated Frederick the Great as a propaganda symbol, presenting him as a proto-fascist strongman who embodied German martial virtues. Sanssouci was used for carefully staged events designed to link the Third Reich with Prussian military glory. The palace appeared in newsreels and propaganda films, its beauty deployed in service of an ideology Frederick himself would have found repugnant. During the Second World War, some of Sanssouci's most valuable artworks were evacuated to salt mines and remote castles, a precaution that saved them from the destruction that was coming. Potsdam was bombed in April of 1945, just days before the war's end. The city center was devastated, with thousands killed and entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Sanssouci itself was hit but not destroyed. Bombs damaged several buildings in the park, shattered windows in the main palace, and cratered the gardens, but the core structure survived. In the chaos of Germany's collapse and occupation, the palace was looted by soldiers and civilians desperate for anything of value. Furniture, paintings, sculptures, decorative objects, even fixtures like door handles and light switches were taken. What remained was a shell, battered and stripped, surrounded by a landscape of destruction. Potsdam fell within the Soviet zone of occupation, which in 1949 became East Germany. The communist authorities initially considered demolishing Sanssouci as a symbol of feudal oppression, but ultimately decided that its cultural and potential propaganda value outweighed ideological purity. The palace became a museum of the working people, a place where citizens could see the decadence of the old regime and appreciate, by contrast, the egalitarian present. Restoration began slowly, hampered by shortages of materials, skilled labor, and funding. What work was completed often followed Soviet aesthetics and methods that prioritized speed over historical accuracy, using modern materials and techniques that would later require undoing. The Cold War divided Potsdam from West Berlin by walls, barbed wire, and minefields, turning the city into a provincial backwater cut off from the capital it had once served. Sanssouci received few Western visitors, as travel to East Germany was difficult and politically fraught. The palace languished in a kind of frozen state, maintained minimally but not actively conserved, its collection depleted by wartime losses and its fabric deteriorating from deferred maintenance. East German authorities had limited resources and many competing priorities, and a Prussian king's summer palace ranked below housing, industry, and military preparedness. Yet, even under these conditions, Sanssouci retained a certain power. East Germans visited in significant numbers, drawn by a complex mixture of motives: genuine interest in history, nostalgia for a pre-war past, and perhaps an unconscious longing for beauty and grace in a system that offered neither. The palace stood as evidence that Germans had once created things of lasting value, a quiet rebuke to the grim functionality of socialist architecture that surrounded it. The staff who worked there, often trained in conservation methods despite limited resources, developed a fierce dedication to preserving what remained, understanding that they were custodians of something fragile and irreplaceable. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and German reunification the following year transformed Sanssouci's circumstances overnight. West German conservation experts arrived and were horrified by what they found: structural damage left unaddressed for decades, inappropriate repairs that had caused further deterioration, environmental controls that were primitive or non-existent, and documentation systems that were incomplete or lost. The newly unified Germany committed significant funding to a comprehensive restoration, understanding that Sanssouci was not merely a regional monument, but a site of national and international importance. The restoration work that began in the early 1990s continues to this day, a project without a clear endpoint. Modern conservation philosophy emphasizes reversibility, using techniques and materials that future conservators can undo if better methods emerge. This means painstaking research, extensive testing, and work that proceeds at a pace that would have baffled 18th-century builders. A single room might take years to restore properly, analyzing layers of paint to determine original colors, sourcing materials that match historical ones in composition and appearance, training craftspeople in techniques that have not been used commercially for 2 centuries. The cost is measured in millions of euros per year, funded by a combination of federal and state budgets, admission fees, private donations, and revenue from event rentals and commercial licensing. Today, Sanssouci receives approximately 2 million visitors annually, making it one of Germany's most popular tourist destinations. This creates a fundamental tension. The palace was designed for the exclusive use of one person and his small circle of guests. Now, thousands of people pass through its rooms each day during peak season, their breath and body heat, and the simple friction of their presence causing measurable damage. The marble floors are worn smooth in traffic patterns. The painted ceilings are exposed to humidity from exhaled breath. The furniture, even behind ropes and barriers, degrades from vibration and light exposure. Every visitor brings the outside world in: dust, pollen, pollutants, microorganisms that colonize surfaces and slowly consume them. Managing this requires a level of environmental control that would have been unimaginable in Frederick's time. The palace is equipped with climate control systems that regulate temperature and humidity within narrow bands, preventing the expansion and contraction that cracks plaster and warps wood. Air filtration removes particulates that would otherwise settle on surfaces and discolor them. Light levels are carefully controlled with window treatments that block ultraviolet radiation while allowing enough natural light to maintain the room's character. Visitors move through on prescribed routes, spending limited time in each space, their numbers restricted during busy periods to prevent crowding that would overwhelm the environmental systems. The staff structure has changed radically. Where once servants worked invisibly to maintain one man's comfort, now a complex organization of specialists maintains a public institution. There are conservators who monitor and treat objects and surfaces, security personnel who protect against theft and vandalism, educators who lead tours and develop programs, administrative staff who manage budgets and coordinate with government agencies, gardeners who maintain over 700 acres of parkland, and facilities managers who oversee mechanical systems, structural maintenance, and ongoing restoration projects. The annual operating budget exceeds 20 million euros, of which admission fees cover perhaps 30%. The remainder comes from public funding, making every visitor's ticket price a subsidy rather than full payment for the experience they receive. The gardens alone consume an extraordinary amount of labor. Maintaining the geometric parterres, the clipped hedges, the gravel paths, and the lawn areas requires a team of 30 gardeners working year-round. The vineyard terraces, partially restored with new glass walls in the late 20th century, produce a small amount of wine each year, more symbolic than commercial, a nod to Frederick's original vision. The trees, many of which are now hundreds of years old, require expert arborists to monitor their health and make decisions about pruning, treatment, or removal when they become dangerous. Fallen trees are milled on site when possible, the lumber used for repairs that require period-appropriate wood species, closing a loop between maintenance and materials that Frederick himself would recognize. Climate change has introduced new challenges that compound the old ones. Summer temperatures in Potsdam are rising, stressing plants that were selected for 18th century climate conditions. Extreme weather events, more frequent and severe, damage trees, erode garden features, and test the palace's drainage systems beyond their design capacity. Winter storms bring freeze-thaw cycles that accelerate the deterioration of stone and masonry. Invasive species, moving northward as temperatures warm, threaten the ecological balance of the park. Conservators must make decisions about adaptation, balancing historical accuracy against survival. Do you replace dead plantings with identical species that may not thrive in future conditions? Or do you choose more resilient alternatives that alter the historical landscape? The philosophical questions multiply. Sanssouci was built to be exclusive, a retreat from the public world. Now it exists only because the public supports it. Frederick wanted invisibility from his servants. Now guides narrate his life to crowds. He built for his own pleasure. Now the palace serves educational and cultural missions he never imagined. The building has been restored. But to which moment? The 1740s, when it was new? The 1780s, when Frederick died? The 1930s, before war damage? Every restoration decision involves choosing one historical moment over others, creating a version of the past that is necessarily artificial. Yet, something authentic persists. Standing in the marble hall at dawn, before the tourists arrive, when the light through the windows falls exactly as it did 270 years ago. The space retains a quality that transcends its troubled history and complex present. The proportions, the interplay of light and decoration, the way the room opens onto the terraced gardens, all of this still works as Frederick intended. It creates a moment of stillness, a brief escape from temporal pressure, a whisper of what he meant by Sanssouci. That this moment now requires millions of euros and hundreds of workers to preserve does not diminish it, but rather reveals its true nature. Beauty is not effortless. It is the visible result of invisible labor, sustained across generations by people whose names we will never know. The cost of paradise is paid in perpetuity. Every painted ceiling requires monitoring and periodic conservation. Every gilded surface must be cleaned with techniques that remove pollution without damaging the gold. Every textile fades and weakens, requiring storage in climate-controlled conditions and eventual replacement with reproductions that cost more than the originals. Every mechanical system installed in the 20th century to protect the 18th century fabric is now aging and must be updated or replaced, each intervention requiring careful planning to avoid harming what it is meant to preserve. The palace demands constant attention, constant funding, constant negotiation between preservation and use, between historical accuracy and contemporary needs. The answer to who truly paid for Frederick's dream is everyone. The workers who built it, many of whose bodies lie in unmarked graves after accidents and simple exhaustion. The Prussian taxpayers whose contributions funded royal pleasure. The soldiers who died in Frederick's wars, their sacrifice converted into stone and gold. The servants who spent lifetimes in invisibility so one man could feel alone. The East German conservators who protected what they could with almost nothing. The modern visitors whose tickets subsidize maintenance they will never see. The German taxpayers whose euros flow into this place year after year, sustaining a beauty they may never personally experience. It is a collective expense spanning centuries, paid by people who had no choice and people who choose freely, bound together by the shared understanding that some things, once created, become larger than their origins and demand preservation regardless of cost. What it costs to keep Sanssouci alive today is everything it has always cost. Money, certainly, but also expertise, compromise, endless patient work, and the willingness to serve something that will outlast any individual contribution. The palace will never be finished, never fully restored, never finally safe. It will always require more than it gives back in quantifiable terms. But what it gives back in unquantifiable terms, in beauty and historical connection, and the evidence that humans can create enduring grace, justifies the effort to those who undertake it. Frederick built a palace without care, but care is all that has allowed it to survive. The paradox was built into the foundation, literal and metaphorical, from the beginning. Every flaw in the original design, every shortcut taken to achieve Frederick's vision, every compromise forced by budget or timeline or the limits of 18th century technology, created vulnerabilities that later generations have struggled to address. Yet those same flaws are part of the palace's story, evidence of human ambition exceeding technical capacity, of aesthetic vision clashing with practical reality, of the gap between dream and execution that defines so much of human endeavor. The decision to build without a basement was aesthetically perfect and structurally catastrophic. The vineyard terraces looked magnificent and produced terrible wine. The fountains were designed to rival Versailles and barely managed to function. The heating system consumed forests and left rooms frigid. Every grandiose gesture contained within it the seeds of future crisis. Yet those gestures are also what makes Sanssouci extraordinary. Perfection is boring and brittle. It is the flaws, the struggles, the adaptations and repairs and ongoing compromises that make a place come alive across centuries. Modern visitors walking through Sanssouci encounter not just Frederick's vision, but the accumulated decisions of everyone who came after. The nephew who neglected it, the 19th century kings who restored it, the museum directors who opened it to the public, the East German conservators who protected it with limited means, the post-reunification specialists who apply contemporary techniques to historical problems. The palace is a palimpsest, layers of intervention visible to those who know how to look, each layer reflecting the values and resources of its time. This is what survival means for a place like Sanssouci. Continuous transformation in service of seeming changelessness, constant work to maintain the illusion of permanence. The truth that Sanssouci teaches is uncomfortable for those who prefer to see beauty as transcendent and pure. Beauty is implicated in systems of power and exploitation. It requires resources diverted from other uses, labor extracted from those who will not benefit from the final product, and ongoing sacrifice to maintain. None of this means beauty is worthless or that we should not create and preserve it, but it does mean we should approach it with clear eyes, acknowledging the full cost and asking whether that cost is justified. In Sanssouci's case, the answer has changed over time. Frederick's contemporaries might have questioned whether one man's pleasure justified such expense. Modern Germans justify preservation on grounds of cultural heritage, historical education, and collective identity. Future generations may calculate the cost-benefit differently again. What remains constant is that beauty does not take care of itself. The name Sanssouci without care was always a fantasy. From the moment the first stone was laid, the palace has demanded intensive, continuous care from hundreds of people whose labor is the invisible foundation on which visible splendor rests. The gardeners who arrive before dawn to rake gravel and sweep leaves. The conservators who spend years repairing a single painted ceiling. The security guards who walk through empty rooms at night, ensuring that what has survived 270 years of war, revolution, neglect, and transformation survives another night. These are the people who truly pay for the dream now, not with money alone, but with their time, skill, and dedication to something that will outlast them. Frederick the Great has been dead for more than 2 centuries. His kingdom is gone, his wars forgotten by most, his philosophical writings unread. What survives is the place he built to escape the burdens of greatness, preserved through the efforts of people who never knew him and never will. The palace stands as evidence that beauty can endure, but only if we choose to bear its cost, not once but continuously, generation after generation, understanding that preservation is not passive maintenance, but active service. A gift we give to people we will never meet, who will walk through these rooms and gardens, and perhaps, for a moment, feel what Frederick felt, that it is possible to create a space of harmony and grace, even if that space is never and can never be without care. If beauty requires endless sacrifice to survive, does its persistence prove our generosity or merely our inability to let go of what we once chose to value?